Such a disinterested enjoyment of nature as shown by Shingen and Kenshin, even in the midst of warlike activities, is known as Furyu, and those without this feeling of Furyu are classed among the most uncultured in Japan. The feeling is not merely aesthetical, it has also a religious significance. It is perhaps the same mental attitude that has created the custom among cultured Japanese of writing a verse in either Japanese or Chinese at the moment of death. The verse is known as the parting with life verse. The Japanese have been taught and trained to be able to find a moment's leisure to detach themselves from the most intense excitements in which they may happen to be placed. Death is the most serious affair absorbing all one's attention, but the cultured Japanese think they ought to be able to transcend it and view it objectively. The custom of leaving a farewell song, though not necessarily observed universally by the cultured even in feudal days, started in all likelihood in the Kamakura period with the Zen monks and their followers. When the Buddha passed into nirvana, he had his disciples about him and gave them his farewell exhortation. This must have been imitated by the Chinese Buddhists, especially by the Zen Buddhists, who left instead of a farewell instruction for their followers and expression of their own views of life. Takeda Shingen's farewell words were a quotation from Zen literature. It is largely left to her own natural bodily perfection, and she has no special need to resort to artificial coloring and powdering in order to look beautiful. This refers to the absolute perfection of reality, from which we all come, and to which we all return, and in which we all are. A world of multitudes passes away and comes again, but what is at the back of it always retains its perfect beauty unchangingly. Uyasugi Kenshin composed his own verses, the one in Chinese and the other in Japanese, thus: Even a lifelong prosperity is but one cup of sake. A life of 49 years is passed in a dream. I know not what life is, nor death. Year in, year out, all but a dream. Both heaven and hell are left behind. I stand in the moonlit dawn, free from clouds of attachment. Following are accounts of the deaths of the Kamakura warriors as recorded in the Taiheike, compiled late in the 14th century. These will clarify, side by side with those of the Yerinji monks, the influence of Zen on Bushido, especially in regard to their attitude toward death. Among the retainers of Hojo Takatoki, who was the last of the Hojo family, there was one Shiaku Shinsakon Nyudo, not very high in the official rank of the samurai hierarchy of Kamakura. When he was about to commit suicide to follow his master, whose destiny was going to be sealed, he called in his eldest son, Saburazaemon, and said to him, Kamakura is doomed, as it is surrounded by enemies on all sides, and I am going to share the fate of the master as his loyal follower. But you are still young, and have not yet been in active service, and are not so intimately related to the master as I have been. You managed to escape the approaching tragedy, and after saving your life, you must become a monk and serve the Buddha, and look after the spiritual welfare of us all. Nobody will blame you for doing this. Saburazaemon, however, showed no inclination to follow his father's rational advice, for he said, Even though I have not yet been actively and personally connected with our master, as your son I have been brought up under the benevolent protection of his grace. If I already followed the life of monkhood, it would be a different matter. Having been born into the family of a samurai, how can I leave you and our master and save myself to become a monk? No shame is greater than this. If you are to share the destiny of our master, let me be your guide to the next world. Even before he finished his last sentence, he disemboweled himself and gave up the ghost. His brother Shiro, observing this, hastily prepared to follow his example. But the father, Nudo, stopped him and said, Do not be so hasty. You must follow order and wait for me. Shiro put his dagger back into its scabbard and sat meekly before his father, waiting the latter's further command. The father now told him to bring him a chair. He sat in it cross-legged in the fashion of a Zen monk, and quietly making ink, dipped his brush into it, and wrote his song of death on a piece of paper. Holding forth this sword, I cut vacuity in twain. In the midst of the great fire, a stream of refreshing breeze. When he finished writing, he committed suicide like the brave samurai that he was, and Shiro completed the deed by cutting off his father's head in accordance with the samurai code of honor. As to himself, using the same sword, he pierced his own body with it up to the hilt and fell forward on the ground dead. At the time of the Hojo downfall, there was another Zen warrior called Nagasaki Jiro Takashige. He called on his Zen master, who also happened to be the teacher of Hojo Takatoki, and asked, "How should a brave warrior behave at a moment like this?" The Zen teacher at once said, "Go straight forward wielding your sword." The warrior at once perceived what it meant. He fought most gallantly until exhausted he fell before his master, Takatoki. This was indeed the kind of spirit Zen cultivated among its warrior followers. Zen did not necessarily argue with them about immortality of the soul, or righteousness, or the divine way, or ethical conduct, but it simply urged going ahead with whatever conclusion, rational or irrational, a man has arrived at. Philosophy may safely be left with intellectual minds. Zen wants to act, and the most effective act, once the mind is made up, is to go on without looking backward. In this respect, Zen is indeed the religion of the samurai warrior. To die isagi-yoku is one of the thoughts very dear to the Japanese heart. In some deaths, if this characteristic is present, crimes committed by the offenders are judged even charitably. Isagi-yoku means leaving no regrets, with a clear conscience, like a brave man, with no reluctance, in full possession of mind, and so on. The Japanese hate to see death met irresolutely and lingeringly. They desire to be blown away like the cherries before the wind, and no doubt this Japanese attitude toward death must have gone very well with the teaching of Zen. The Japanese may not have any specific philosophy of life, but they have decidedly one of death, which may sometimes appear to be that of recklessness. The spirit of the samurai, deeply breathing Zen into itself, propagated its philosophy even among the masses. The latter, even when they are not particularly trained in the way of the warrior, have imbibed his spirit and are ready to sacrifice their lives for any cause they think worthy. This has repeatedly been proved in the wars Japan has so far had to go through. A foreign writer on Japanese Buddhism aptly remarks that Zen is the Japanese character. Now let us turn to Zen and swordsmanship. The sword is the soul of the samurai. Therefore, when the samurai is the subject, the sword inevitably comes with him. The samurai who wishes to be faithful to his vocation will have first of all to ask himself the question, how shall I transcend birth and death so that I can be ready at any moment to give up my life if necessary for my Lord? This means exposing himself before the enemy's sword stroke or directing his own sword toward himself. The sword thus becomes most intimately connected with the life of the samurai, and it has become the symbol of loyalty and self-sacrifice. The reverence universally paid to it in various ways proves this. The sword has thus a double office to perform: to destroy anything that opposes the will of its owner, and to sacrifice all the impulses that arise from the instinct of self-preservation. The one relates itself to the spirit of patriotism, or sometimes militarism, while the other has a religious connotation of loyalty and self-sacrifice. In the case of the former, very frequently the sword may mean destruction, pure and simple, and then it is the symbol of force, sometimes devilish force. It must therefore be controlled and consecrated by the second function. Its conscientious owner is always mindful of this truth, for then destruction is turned against the evil spirit. The sword comes to be identified with the annihilation of things that lie in the way of peace, justice, progress, and humanity. It stands for all that is desirable for the spiritual welfare of the world at large. It is now the embodiment of life and not of death. Zen speaks of the sword of life and the sword of death, and it is the work of a great Zen master to know when and how to wield either of them. Manjushri carries a sword in his right hand and a sutra in his left. This may remind us of the Prophet Muhammad, but the sacred sword of Manjushri is not to kill any sentient beings, but our own greed, anger, and folly. It is directed toward ourselves, for when this is done, the outside world, which is the reflection of what is within us, becomes also free from greed, anger, and folly. Achala also carries a sword, and he will destroy all the enemies who oppose the practice of the Buddhist virtues. Manjushri is positive, Achala is negative. Achala's anger burns like a fire and will not be put down until it burns up the last camp of the enemy. He will then assume his original features as the Vairochana Buddha, whose servant and manifestation he is. Vairochana holds no sword. He is the sword itself, sitting alone with all the worlds within himself. In the following mondo, the one sword signifies this sword. Kusunoki Masashige, a warrior of the 14th century, came to a Zen monastery at Hyogo when he was about to meet the overwhelming army of Ashikaga Takauji at the Minatogawa. Masashige asked the master, "When a man is at the parting of the ways between life and death, how should he behave?" Answered the master, "Cut off your dualism and let the one sword stand serenely by itself against the sky." This absolute one sword is neither the sword of life nor the sword of death. It is the sword from which this world of dualities issues, and in which they all have their being. It is the Vairochana Buddha himself. You take hold of him, and you know how to behave where ways part. The sword here represents the force of intuitive or instinctual directness, which, unlike the intellect, does not divide itself, blocking its own passageway. It marches onward without looking backward or sideways. It is like Chuanzi's dissecting knife that cuts along the joints as if they were waiting to be separated. Chuanzi would say then, the joints separate by themselves, and then the knife, even after many years of use, is as sharp as when it first came from the hands of the grinder. The one sword of reality never wears out after cutting up ever so many victims of selfishness. The sword is also connected with Shinto, but I do not think that it has attained in this connection so highly developed a spiritual significance as in Buddhism. It still betrays its naturalistic origin. It is not a symbol, but an object endowed with some mysterious power. In the feudal days of Japan, the samurai class cherished this kind of idea toward the sword, although it is difficult to define exactly what was going on in their minds. At least they paid the utmost respect to it. At the samurai's death it was placed beside his bed, and when a child was born it found its place in the room. The idea was probably to prevent any evil spirits from entering the room that might interfere with the safety and happiness of the departed, or the coming spirit. Here lingers an animistic way of thinking. The idea of a sacred sword, too, may be interpreted in this way. It is noteworthy that when making swords, the swordsmith invokes the aid of the guardian god. To invite him to the workshop, the smith surrounds it with consecrated ropes, thus excluding evil spirits, while he goes through the ceremony of ablution and dons the ceremonial dress in which he works. While striking the iron bar and giving it baths of fire and water, the smith and his helper are in the most intensified state of mind. Confident the god's help will be given to their work, they exert themselves to the limit of their powers, mental, physical, and spiritual. The sword thus produced is a true work of art. The Japanese sword must reflect something deeply appealing to the soul of the people. They look at it, indeed, not as a weapon of destruction, but as an object of inspiration. Hence the legend of the swordsmith, Okazake Masamune, and his products. Masamune flourished in the latter part of the Kamakura era, and his works are uniformly prized by all the sword connoisseurs for their excellent qualities. As far as the edge of the blade is concerned, Masamune may not exceed Muramasa, one of his ablest disciples, but Masamune is said to have something morally inspiring that comes from his personality. The legend goes thus. When someone was trying to test the sharpness of a Muramasa, he placed it in a current of water and watched how it acted against the dead leaves flowing downstream. He saw that every leaf that met the blade was cut in twain. He then placed a Masamune, and he was surprised to find that the leaves avoided the blade. The Masamune was not bent on killing. It was more than a cutting implement. Whereas the Muramasa could not go beyond cutting, there was nothing divinely inspiring in it. The Muramasa is terrible. The Masamune is humane. One is despotic and imperialistic. The other is superhuman, if we may use this form of expression. Masamune almost never engraved his name on the hilt, although this was customary with swordsmiths. The no-play Kokaji gives us some idea about the moral and religious significance of the sword among the Japanese. The play was probably composed in the Ashikaga era. The Emperor Ichijo, who reigned from 986 to 1011, once ordered a sword to be made by Kokaji Munechika, who was one of the great swordsmiths of the day. Kunechika felt greatly honored, but he could not fill the order unless he had an able assistant equal in skill to himself. He prayed to the god of Inari, who was his guardian god, to send him someone fully competent for the work. In the meantime, he prepared his sacred platform, in due accordance with the traditional rites. When all the process of purification was completed, he offered this prayer. The work I'm going to undertake is not just for my selfish glorification. It is to obey the august order of the emperor who reigns over the entire world. I pray to all the gods numbering as many as the sands of the Ganges to come here and give their help to this humble Munechika, who is now going to do his utmost to produce a sword worthy of the virtue of the august patron. Looking upward to the sky and prostrating himself, he offers to the gods the nusa, a pendant of paper cuttings that is symbolically offered to the Shinto gods, a symbol of his most earnest desire to accomplish the work successfully. Would that the gods might have pity on his sincerity. A voice is now heard from somewhere. Pray, pray, O Munechika, in all humbleness and in all earnestness. The time is come to strike the iron. Trust the gods, and the work will be done. A mysterious figure appeared before him and helped him in hammering the heated iron, which came out of the forge in due time with every desirable mark of perfection and auspiciousness. The emperor was pleased with the sword, which was worthy to be treasured as sacred and merit-producing. As something of divinity enters into the making of the sword, its owner and user ought also to respond to the inspiration. He ought to be a spiritual man, not an agent of brutality. His mind ought to be at one with the soul which animates the cold steel. The great swordsmen have never been tired of instilling this feeling into the minds of their pupils. When the Japanese say that the sword is the soul of the samurai, we must remember all that goes with it: loyalty, self-sacrifice, reverence, benevolence, and the cultivation of other higher feelings. Here is the true samurai. It was natural, therefore, for the samurai who carried two swords, the longer one for attack and defense, and the shorter one for self-destruction when necessary, to train himself with the utmost zeal in the art of swordsmanship. He could never be separated from the weapon that was the supreme symbol of his dignity and honor. Training in its use was, beside its practical purpose, conducive to his moral and spiritual enhancement. It was here that the swordsman joined hands with Zen. Although this fact has already been demonstrated to a certain extent, I wish to give here further quotations illuminative of the intimate relationship between Zen and the sword, in the form of a letter from Takuan, the 17th century abbot of Daitokuji in Kyoto, to Yagyu Tajima no Kame Munenori, one of the great family of swordsmen who flourished in the early Tokugawa era. The letter concerned the relationship between Zen and the art of swordsmanship. As the letter is long and somewhat repetitive, I have condensed or paraphrased it here, trying to preserve the important thoughts of the original, and sometimes interpolating explanations and notes. It is an important document in more ways than one, as it touches upon the essential teachings of Zen as well as the secrets of art generally. In Japan, perhaps as in other countries too, mere technical knowledge of an art is not enough to make someone really its master. They ought to have delved deeply into the inner spirit. This spirit is grasped only when the mind is in complete harmony with the principles of life itself. That is, when one attains to a certain state of mind known as mushin, or no mind. In Buddhist phraseology, it means going beyond the dualism of all forms of life and death, good and evil, being and non-being. This is where all arts merge into Zen. In this letter to the great master of swordsmanship, Takuan strongly emphasizes the significance of mushin, which may be regarded in a way as corresponding to the concept of the unconscious. Psychologically speaking, this state of mind gives itself up unreservedly to an unknown power that comes to one from nowhere, and yet seems strong enough to possess the whole field of consciousness and make it work for the unknown. Hereby, he becomes a kind of automaton, so to speak, as far as his own consciousness is concerned. But as Takuan explains, it ought not to be confused with the helpless passivity of an inorganic thing, such as a piece of rock or a block of wood. He is unconsciously conscious, or consciously unconscious. A further note regarding the letter's heading. Mahayana Buddhism sometimes distinguishes 52 stages leading up to the supreme enlightenment, Sambodhi. Ignorance, or avidya, may be regarded as the first of those stages, and the affects, or kilesas, are affective disturbances which accompany those who abide on this stage. With these preliminary remarks, the following instruction of Takuan will become intelligible. Takuan's letter on the mystery of Prajna immovable. Affects attendant on the abiding stage of ignorance. Ignorance means the absence of enlightenment, that is, delusion. The abiding stage means the point where the mind stops to abide. In Buddhist training we speak of 52 stages, of which one is a stage where the mind attaches itself to any object it encounters. This attaching is known as tomaru, stopping or abiding. The mind stops with one object instead of flowing from one object to another, as the mind acts when it follows its own nature. In the case of swordsmanship, for instance, when the opponent tries to strike you, your eyes at once catch the movement of his sword, and you may strive to follow it. But as soon as this takes place, you cease to be master of yourself, and you are sure to be beaten. This is called stopping. But there is another way of meeting the opponent's sword. No doubt you see the sword about to strike you. But do not let your mind stop there. Have no intention to counterattack him in response to his threatening move. Cherish no calculating thoughts whatever. You simply perceive the opponent's move. You do not allow your mind to stop with it. You move on just as you are toward the opponent and make use of his attack by turning it on himself. Then his sword meant to kill you will become your own, and the weapon will fall on the opponent himself. In Zen, this is known as seizing the enemy's spear and using it as the weapon to kill him. The idea is that the opponent's sword being transferred into your hands becomes the instrument of his own destruction. This is no sword in your terminology. As soon as the mind stops with an object of whatever nature, be it the opponent's sword or your own, the man himself bent on striking, or the sword in his hands, the mode or the measure of the move, you cease to be master of yourself and are sure to fall a victim to the enemy's sword. When you set yourself against him, your mind will be carried away by him. Therefore do not even think of yourself. That is to say, the opposition of subject and object is to be transcended. For beginners, it is not a bad idea to keep the mind thoughtfully applied to their own disciplining. It is important not to get your attention arrested by the sword or by the measure of its movement. When your mind is concerned with the sword, you become your own captive. This is all due to your mind being arrested by something external and losing its mastership. This, I believe, is all very well known to you, I only call your attention to it from my Zen point of view. In Buddhism, this stopping mind is called delusion, hence, affects attendant on the abiding stage of ignorance. A personal note on the text: the swordsman's unconscious and the psychoanalyst's unconscious are not to be confused, for the former is free from the notion of the self. The perfect swordsman takes no cognizance of the enemy's personality, no more than of his own, for he is an indifferent onlooker to the fatal drama of life and death in which he himself is the most active participant. In spite of all the concern he has or ought to have, he is above himself. He transcends the dualistic comprehension of the situation. Yet he is not a contemplative mystic. He is in the thickest of the deadly combat. This distinction is to be remembered when we compare Eastern culture with Western. Even in such arts as that of swordsmanship, in which the principle of opposition is most in evidence, the one who is to be most intensely interested in it is advised to be liberated from the idea. Now, to return to the letter, on the subject of Prajna immovable. Prajna is possessed by all Buddhas, and also by all sentient beings. It is transcendental wisdom flowing through the relativity of things, and it remains immovable, though this does not mean the immovability or insensibility of such objects as a piece of wood or rock. It is the mind itself endowed with infinite motilities. It moves forward and backward, to the left and to the right, to every one of the 10 quarters, and knows no hindrance in any direction. Prajna immovable is this mind, capable of infinite movements. There is a Buddhist god called Fudo Myu, or Achala Vidyaraja, the immovable. He is represented holding a sword in his right hand and a rope in his left. His teeth are bared and his eyes glare angrily. He stands up threateningly in order to destroy the devils who try to do harm to Buddha's teaching. Though he is thus seen assuming a realistic form, he is not hiding anywhere on earth. He is the symbolic protector of Buddhism, essentially incarnating Prajna immovable for us sentient beings. When the ordinary people confront him, they are reminded of what he stands for and will refrain from interfering with the spread of Buddhist doctrine. The wise, on the other hand, who are approaching a state of enlightenment, realize that Fudo symbolizes Prajna immovable as the destroyer of delusion. He who thus becomes enlightened and carries on his life as exemplified by Fudo Myu will not be touched even by devilish spirits. Myu is the symbol of immovability both of mind and body. Not to move means not to stop with an object that is seen, for as it is seen it passes on and the mind is not arrested. When the mind stops with each object as it is presented, the mind is disturbed with all kinds of thought and feeling. The stopping inevitably leads to the moving that is disturbance. Though the mind is thus subject to stoppings, it in itself remains unmoved, however superficially it may seem so. For instance, suppose 10 men are opposing you, each in succession ready to strike you with a sword. As soon as one is disposed of, you will move on to another without permitting the mind to stop with any. However rapidly one blow may follow another, you leave no time to intervene between the two. Every one of the 10 will thus be successively and successfully dealt with. This is possible only when the mind moves from one object to another without being stopped or arrested by anything. If the mind is unable to move on in this fashion, it is sure to lose the game, somewhere between 2 encounters. Kwanon Bosatsu, also called Avalokiteshvara, is sometimes represented with 1,000 arms, each holding a different instrument. If his mind stops with the use, for instance, of a bow, all the other arms, 999 in number, will be of no use whatever. It is only because of his mind not stopping with the use of one arm, but moving from one instrument to another, that all his arms prove useful with the utmost degree of efficiency. Even Kwanon cannot be expected to equip himself with 1,000 arms on one body. The figure is meant to demonstrate that when Prajna immovable is realized, even as many as 1,000 arms on one body may each and all be serviceable in one way or another. I will give another illustration. When I look at a tree, I perceive one of the leaves is red, and my mind stops with this leaf. When this happens, I see just one leaf and fail to take cognizance of the innumerable other leaves of the tree. If instead of this I look at the tree without any preconceived ideas, I shall see all the leaves. One leaf effectively stops my mind from seeing all the rest. But when the mind moves on without stopping, it takes up hundreds of thousands of leaves without fail. When this is understood, we become Kwannon. The simple-minded bow before Kwannon, taking him for an extraordinary being simply because his one body is seen as in possession of 1,000 arms and 1,000 eyes. Some, however, whose intelligence does not go very far, deny the reality of Kwannon, saying, "How can one person be provided with so many arms as 1,000? Those who know the reason of things will neither blindly believe nor hastily negate. They will discover that it is the wisdom of Buddhism to demonstrate the rationality of things by means of one object. This is also the case with other schools of teaching, especially with Shintoism. Those symbolical figures are not to be taken naively as they appear, nor are they to be rejected as irrational. One must know that there is reason in them. Reasons may be varied, but they all point ultimately to one truth. Beginners all start from the first stage of ignorance and affects, finally reaching that of Prajna immovable. And when they reach the final stage, they find that it stands next to the first stage. There is reason for this. To state it in terms of swordsmanship, the genuine beginner knows nothing about the way of holding and managing the sword, and much less of his concern for himself. When the opponent tries to strike him, he instinctively parries it. This is all he can do. But as soon as the training starts, he is taught how to handle the sword, where to keep the mind, and many other technical tricks which makes his mind stop at various junctures. For this reason, whenever he tries to strike the opponent, he feels unusually hampered. He has lost altogether the original sense of innocence and freedom. But as days and years go by, as his training acquires fuller maturity, his bodily attitude and his way of managing the sword advance towards no-mindedness, which resembles the state of mind he had at the very beginning of training when he knew nothing, when he was altogether ignorant of the art. The beginning and the end thus turn into next-door neighbors. First, we start counting 1, 2, 3, and when finally 10 is counted, we return to 1. In musical scales, one may start with the lowest pitch and gradually ascend to the highest. When the highest is reached, one finds it located next to the lowest. In a similar way, when the highest stage is reached in the study of Buddhist teaching, a man turns into a kind of simpleton who knows nothing of Buddha, nothing of his teaching, and is devoid of all learning or scholarly acquisitions. The ignorance and affects characterizing the first stage are merged into Prajna immovable of the last stage of Buddhist discipline. Intellectual calculations are lost sight of, and a state of no-mindedness, mushin, or of no-thoughtness, munen, prevails. When the ultimate perfection is attained, the body and limbs perform by themselves what is assigned to them to do with no interference from the mind. The technical skill is so autonomized it is completely divorced from conscious efforts. Bukoku Kokushi of Kamakura has the poem, "Though not consciously trying to guard the rice fields from intruders, the scarecrow is not after all standing to no purpose." All is like this. The scarecrow, in imitation of a human figure, is erected in the middle of the rice paddies. It holds a bow and arrow as if ready to shoot, and seeing this, birds and animals are frightened away. This human figure is not endowed with a mind, but it scares away the deer. The perfect man who has attained the highest stage of training may be likened to it. All is left to the unconscious or reflexive activities of the body and limbs, whereas the mind itself stops with no objects and at no points. nor is it to be located at any definitely designable spot. Yet it here exists all by itself, with no thoughts, no affects, resembling a scarecrow in the rice fields. It is the case of a simple-minded man whose naive intelligence does not go very far, holds to himself, and is not self-assertive. This non-assertiveness also applies to one who has attained the highest degree of intelligence. But there are some who know a great deal, and just because of this knowledge they put themselves very much forward. We come across many such these days among people of my profession, and I am really ashamed of them. We have to distinguish between two ways of training. One is spiritual, the other practical. As I said before, as far as spirituality is concerned, it is a very simple matter when it is realized to its full extent. It all depends on how one gives up one's own ignorance and affects and attains to no-mindedness. This has already been developed step by step. But training in detailed technique is also not to be neglected. The understanding of principle alone cannot lead one to the mastery of movements of the body and its limbs. By practical details, I mean such as what you call the 5 ways of posing the body, designated each by one character. The principle of spirituality is to be grasped, this goes without saying, but at the same time one must be trained in the technique of swordplay. But training is never to be one-sided. Ri and Ji are like 2 wheels of a cart. A note on the text. Ri and Ji are terms used very much in Keigon philosophy. Ji is a particular object or event, and Ri is a universal principle. As long as these two are kept separate, life loses its freedom and spontaneity, and one fails to be a master of oneself. Psychologically speaking, this is the unconscious breaking into the field of consciousness when consciousness loses itself, abandoning itself to the dictates of the unconscious. Religiously, it is dying to oneself and living in Christ, or as Bunan Zenji would say, living as a dead man. In the case of a swordsman, he must free himself from all ideas involving life and death, gain and loss, right and wrong, giving himself up to a power which lives deeply in his inner being. Ri and Ji are then in harmonious cooperation. Bunan's poem reads, "While living, be a dead man, be thoroughly dead, and behave as you like, and all is well." I now return to Takuan's letter, with the topic of spark of the flint striking steel. This is another way of expressing the idea not to leave a hairbreadth interval. When a flint strikes steel, no moment is lost before a spark issues from the contact. This is likened to the mind not stopping with any one object, and no time being left for deliberation, for affects of any sort to assert themselves. It does not mean just the instantaneity of events happening one after another. The point is not to let the mind stop with anything. Mere instantaneity is of no avail if the mind stops, even for a moment. As soon as there is a moment's stoppage, your mind is no longer your own, for it is then placed under another's control. When the mind calculates so as to be quick in movement, the very thought makes the mind captive. You are no more master of yourself. In Saigyo's collection of poems, Sankashu, we have, "As I understand you to be a man who has grown weary of the world, I only think of you as not at all longing for a temporary shelter." Let me take a moment to explain this. Longing for is, in Japanese, kokoro tomeru, of which Takuan talks so much in his letter. The second part of the poem may also be translated, "I only think that you would not have your mind stopped with a temporary shelter." To return to the letter, Takuan writes, "This is said to have been composed by a courtesan of Yaguchi. The reference I wish to make is to the latter part of the poem containing the phrase kokoro tomuna, not to have the mind stopped. For this applies most fittingly to the art of swordsmanship, which ultimately consists in not having one's mind stopped with any object. In Zen Buddhism, one asks, 'What is Buddha?' And the master raises his fist. 'What is the ultimate signification of Buddhist teaching?' And the master replies, even before the questioner fully finishes, 'A spray of plum blossoms,' or 'the cypress tree in the courtyard.' The point concerned here is not necessarily the appropriateness of the answer, but to see the mind not stopping with anything. Such a mind stops neither with the color nor with the odor. This non-stopping mind, in its suchness, or Tai, is blessed as a god or honored as a Buddha, which is no less than the Zen mind or the ultimate limit of an art. An answer given after deliberation to a question such as the above may be splendid and full of wisdom, but it is, after all, at the stage of ignorance and affects, avidya kilesa. Zen is concerned with a movement of instantaneity in which the flint emits a spark when it strikes steel. It is the same as a flash of lightning. A voice calls out, "Oh, Uyemon," and the man immediately responds to it, "Yes." Here is Prajna immovable. When the man is called, "Oh, Uyemon," he stops and deliberates, wondering, what business can it be? Finally, the answer is given. What is it? This comes from a mind abiding in ignorance and affects. Whenever or wherever it stops, this is the sign of being moved by something external, which is a delusion, and such is said to be the mind of an ordinary being belonging to the stage of ignorance and affects. On the other hand, that which gives an immediate answer to the call, "O Uyemon," is the Prajna of all Buddhas. Buddhas and all beings are not two, nor are gods and men. God, or the Buddha, is the name given to such a mind, identified with Prajna. The way of the gods, the way of poetry, the way of Confucius. There may be many ways, or Tao, but they are all ways of illustrating the one mind. When they just follow the letters and have no true understanding of what the one mind, the Prajna immovable, is, they abuse it in every possible way throughout their life. They are day and night engaged in doing good things and evil things according to their karma. They would abandon the family, ruin the whole nation, or do anything contrary to the dictates of the one mind. They are all confused and altogether fail to see what the one mind looks like. Unfortunately, there are only a few people who have really penetrated into the depths of the one mind. The rest of us are sadly going astray. But we must know that it is not enough just to see what the mind is. We must put into practice all that makes it up in our daily life. We may talk about it glibly. We may write books to explain it, but that is far from being enough. However much we may talk about water and describe it quite intelligently, that does not make it real water. So with fire, mere talking of it will not make the mouth burn. To know what they are means to experience them in actual concreteness. A book on cooking will not cure our hunger. To feel satisfied, we must have actual food. So long as we do not go beyond mere talking, we are not true knowers.